She looked right at me and asked if I had a reservation. My own daughter, standing in the foyer of the house I built with 31 years of my hands, asking me if I had a reservation. I didn't answer right away. I just stood there on the front step. The same step where I'd taught her to ride her bike, where I'd waved her off to prom, where I'd stood with her mother the morning we brought her home from the hospital. And I looked at her face. She was wearing a white blouse I didn't recognize, her hair pulled back the way her mother used to wear hers. She looked tired, not tired like she needed sleep. Tired in a way that had settled into her bones. She didn't know me. 8 years. 8 years, and my own daughter didn't know my face. I need to back up. My name is not important. What I built is. In 1987, I started a small lumber supply company out of a rented garage on the edge of Muskoka, Ontario. My wife and I had just gotten married. We had $40 in a joint account and a used Ford pickup with a cracked windshield we'd been putting off fixing since October. I worked the yard myself, loading, hauling, driving, 6 days a week for the first 4 years. She kept the books at the kitchen table after her shifts at the hospital. We didn't take a vacation until our daughter was 3 years old, and even then it was 3 nights at a rented cottage 2 hours north. We thought it was the greatest luxury in the world. By 1999, we had 12 employees. By 2005, 47. By the time I turned 60, Calloway Forest Supply had contracts with 3 of the largest residential developers in central Ontario. The business was worth somewhere between $14 and $18 million, depending on who was doing the valuing and what the market was doing that month. We had a property on Lake Rousseau. Not the biggest cottage up there, not the flashiest, but ours. Cedar dock. A canoe I'd refinished myself. My wife's garden along the south-facing slope. My wife passed in the spring of 2014. Ovarian cancer. 7 months from diagnosis to the end. I don't talk about that period very much. There are some things that language just doesn't reach. After she was gone, I poured myself back into the business. It was the only thing that made sense. My daughter had married 3 years earlier, a man who worked in commercial real estate in Toronto. Sharp dresser, firm handshake. The kind of man who always seems to be calculating something when he smiles. I won't say I disliked him from the start. That's not quite true. I was cautious. There's a difference. He started coming around the office, asking questions. He was curious, he said, about the operational side of things. Wanted to understand how his father-in-law's company ran. I thought it was admirable at the time. I thought it meant he respected what I'd built. I showed him everything. The contracts, the supplier relationships, the land holdings, the equipment valuations, everything. I turned 64 in March of 2016. That September I had a stroke, not a small one. I was alone in the office when it happened, a Saturday morning, which was when I did my best thinking, when the yard was quiet and the phones weren't ringing. My assistant found me on Monday. By then, I had been on the floor of my own office for nearly 48 hours. The doctors in Bracebridge stabilized me and transferred me to Sunnybrook in Toronto. I was in a coma for 11 days. When I came out of it, I couldn't speak clearly, couldn't move my right side, couldn't remember the names of things I'd known all my life. My daughter visited twice in those first weeks. Her husband came once and spent most of the visit on his phone in the hallway. The rehabilitation was long. I was transferred to a facility in Barrie, a good one, private, not the kind of place where you feel forgotten. I could walk again within 8 months. My speech came back slowly, the way a radio signal strengthens when you drive toward the tower. I was coherent by the end of the first year, mostly myself by the end of the second. But by then, things had already moved. The first thing I noticed, in small pieces, was that my calls to the office weren't being returned the way they used to be. My longtime office manager, a woman who had been with me since 2001, who knew the business as well as I did, told me during one of my visits that my son-in-law had been coming in regularly, had been introduced to the staff as someone who was helping with the transition. I asked her what transition. She looked at the floor. He had gone to my daughter and told her I wasn't going to recover. That was the version I pieced together later. He told her I'd be in a care facility for the rest of my life, that the business needed someone at the helm, that it would be irresponsible to let it drift. He had a lawyer draft documents. I don't know entirely what was said to my daughter, or what she believed, or how much she understood. What I know is that she signed things she shouldn't have signed. and he filed things he had no right to file. And by the time I was well enough to understand what had happened, the controlling interest in Calloway Forest Supply had been transferred to a numbered company he'd registered in his own name. He'd also taken the Lake Rousseau property. He'd done it quietly, methodically, the way a man does something he's been planning for a long time. I spent 6 months living in a rented room in Barrie, trying to understand what had happened to my own life. My lawyer, a young woman who came recommended by a friend of a friend, who turned out to be one of the most capable people I've ever worked with, told me the situation was complicated but not hopeless. She said we needed to move carefully. She said I needed to be patient. Patience was the one thing the stroke had actually improved in me. I'm going to tell you something about the years between the stroke and the day I stood on my own front step being asked if I had a reservation. They weren't only dark. There were mornings in Barrie when I'd sit by the window with my coffee and watch the light come up over the rooftops and feel something that wasn't quite peace, but was in the same neighborhood as it. I learned how to cook properly for the first time in my life. I started going to a men's group on Thursday evenings at the community center. Retired guys, mostly, some veterans, some widowers, a few men who'd had their own health crises and were figuring out what came next. I didn't talk much at first. Then I did. It helped more than I expected. I also spent a great deal of time getting the evidence in order. My son-in-law had been careful, but not careful enough. He hadn't counted on me recovering. He'd assumed I was finished, and that assumption had made him sloppy in ways that only became visible when you looked as closely and over a long period of time. There were transfers made when my medical power of attorney was in questionable standing. There were signatures on documents that post-dated the legal window in which they could have been validly obtained. There was a pattern of withdrawals from the business accounts in the year following my stroke, not dramatic amounts, not the kind of thing that would flag immediately, but consistent and directional, and impossible to explain innocently once you added them up. My lawyer added them up. She also found something he really hadn't counted on. In 2013, before my wife passed, I had updated my will and my corporate structure on the advice of my accountant. One of the things we had done, quietly, without fanfare, because it was just good planning, was establish a secondary holding structure for certain assets. The Lake Rousseau property was held in that structure. It was not part of the estate that my son-in-law had managed to get his hands on. He had filed paperwork claiming it. The paperwork was fraudulent. That was the piece my lawyer had been waiting for. She brought in a forensic accountant. Then she contacted the Ontario Securities Commission, because some of what he'd done with the business accounts touched on securities regulations in ways that opened a separate door. Then she made a call to the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit. I didn't rush any of it. I let it build. I kept my rented room. I kept going to the men's group on Thursdays. I kept getting up before the sun and sitting with my coffee and watching the light come up. What I want to tell you about the day I came back to the house is that I almost didn't go. My lawyer had advised against it. She said we had everything we needed, that the legal process was underway, that there was no practical reason for me to go there in person. She was right about all of that. But there was something I needed to see. I couldn't explain it in terms she'd find legally useful. I just needed to know what had happened to my daughter. Not to the business, not to the property, to her. I drove up from Barrie on a Wednesday morning in early October. The maples along the highway were going, that particular red that Southern Ontario puts on in October, like it's trying to remind you what beauty costs. I'd driven that road 400 times if I'd driven it once. I knew every curve of it. The house looked different. Not physically, the structure was the same. The cedars I'd planted along the drive were taller now, which made sense. 8 years does that. But the feeling of it was different. There was a sign near the gate, elegant, understated, cream-colored with dark green lettering. It said the property was available for private events and corporate retreats. My house, my wife's garden, available for corporate retreats. I parked on the road and sat in the car for a while. Then I got out and walked up the drive. She was in the foyer when I came through the door, or rather, when I rang the bell. Because there was a bell now. Because this was no longer a home but a venue. She was wearing a white blouse and dark trousers, and she had a clipboard in her hand, and she looked at me the way you look at a stranger who's come to the wrong address. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked. I looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at me with polite, professional patience. She'd been trained to deal with difficult guests. She was dealing with me the way she'd been trained. I built this house, I said. Something moved across her face, very small. She blinked. I'm sorry? The front steps, I said. The boards are cedar. I laid them myself in the summer of 1994. Your mother chose the width. She said the standard width felt too narrow, like you were being funneled in. She wanted it to feel generous, so I made them wider. She had gone very still. The newel post on the staircase, I said. I carved the detail on the cap myself. Your initials are on the underside of the cap. I put them there the day we moved in. You were 7 years old and you wanted your name on everything. Her clipboard dropped. She caught it, but barely. Dad? She whispered. I'd spent 8 years rehearsing that moment, in the rented room, in the rehabilitation facility, on the drives up and down that highway. I'd imagined saying something significant. Something that would capture what those years had cost. I didn't say anything for a while. I just opened my arms. She crossed the foyer in about 3 steps and held on to me the way she used to hold on to me when she was small, and something had frightened her. She was shaking. I could feel it, her whole body. She kept saying she was sorry. She said it over and over, the word losing its shape as she said it, becoming just sound, just breath. I held her, and I looked around my foyer and I thought about my wife, who would have stood in that exact spot and known exactly what to say to make this easier. We sat in the kitchen. Still the kitchen, at least. Still a kitchen and not some converted hospitality space. And she told me everything. How her husband had come to her in the early weeks after the stroke and told her the doctors had said I wouldn't recover. How he'd presented documents she hadn't understood fully and told her they were necessary to protect the business. How she'd been so frightened and so grief-struck, losing her father so soon after losing her mother, that she had trusted him in a way she now understood she shouldn't have. How things had shifted over the years. How he'd changed. How the business had become his thing, not hers. How she'd ended up here, running the venue operations, which she hadn't chosen but had gradually become the only role available to her, in a house that had once been hers. She had a son, 3 years old, I hadn't known. I had a grandson I hadn't known about. She showed me a photo on her phone. He had her eyes and her mother's mouth and his grandfather's ears, which I told her, and she laughed for the first time since I'd walked through the door. I told her I wasn't there to cause trouble for her. I told her that what was coming was not about her. I told her that the lawyers and the financial investigators were handling things and that my goal was never punishment, it was correction. There's a difference between those two things. My wife used to say that. She said punishment is about the person who was wronged. Correction is about the wrong itself. I wanted the wrong corrected. It took another 11 months. My son-in-law's numbered company was dissolved by court order. The fraudulent filings related to the Lake Rousseau property were voided. The RCMP investigation resulted in charges, fraud over $5,000, breach of fiduciary duty related to the business accounts, and 3 additional counts I'll let the public record speak to. He hired 2 different law firms. They did what they could. It wasn't enough. Calloway Forest Supply was returned to its proper ownership structure. I brought back my office manager, who had stayed on through all of it, watching, keeping her own records, waiting, she told me, because she'd believed I would come back. The business needed work. He'd run it without much care for its long-term health, taking what he could while it lasted. But the bones of it were good, because the bones of it were what I'd built, and I'd built them to last. I sold the company 14 months later, a fair price, to a buyer who would run it well. I didn't need to hold on to it any longer. I'd built to build something, and that something, the cottage, the security, the proof of a life lived with integrity, was what I cared about preserving. The Lake Rousseau property we kept. My daughter and my grandson live there now. She's replanting her mother's garden along the south-facing slope. She tells me she's following the notes her mother left in an old journal she found in a box in the storage room. Plant names, spacing, sketches of where the sun hits in different seasons. Her mother had written it all down. I didn't know she'd kept that journal. I cried when my daughter told me about it. I'm not ashamed of that. I spend 3 weeks up there every summer. I wake up early and make coffee and take it down to the dock and sit and watch the lake. My grandson has started coming to find me in the mornings. He walks down the dock in his bare feet, serious little face, and sits beside me and looks at the water like he's trying to figure out what I see in it. He's 3 years old, and he's already got my habits. His mother says, "This is my fault." She's not wrong. I want to say something to you before I finish, because I think it's the thing I most needed to hear during those years in the rented room, and I didn't hear it enough. Recovery is not a straight line. Some mornings you wake up and you feel something close to whole, and some mornings you wake up and it's all there again. The weight of it, the disbelief that this is your life, the grief for the version of things you thought you were going to have. That's not weakness. That's the honest shape of what it means to lose something that mattered to you, and then try to build again from what's left. What I learned, slowly, imperfectly, over 8 years of mornings with coffee and gradually improving speech, and Thursday evenings with men I'd never have known otherwise, is that the thing that sustains you is not anger. Anger is useful for a short time. It gets you moving when nothing else will. But it burns, and it burns you first. What sustains you is clarity. Knowing what you are. Knowing what you built and why you built it and what it was actually for. Knowing that the measure of a man is not the number on the business valuation, or the size of the property, or the power someone managed to steal from him for a few years. The measure of a man is what he comes back to. And what I came back to was a 3-year-old with his grandmother's mouth in my ears, sitting beside me on a dock in Muskoka at 6 in the morning, looking out at a lake neither of us had words for yet. That's enough. That has always been enough.